It needs explanation because, first of all, I'm making a scientific statement, okay? And so any scientific statement is always subject to change by new data comes along. New data comes along, shows God exists, we have to believe. If there's good experiments that prove that, we have to change that picture. So we're talking about how the situation is now. But what I'm saying is that there is so much data, so much evidence that has piled up over the centuries that we can make the kind of statement that you make when you're in a court of law, when you prove something beyond a reasonable doubt. So this is what I say that we've proven here. We've proven beyond a reasonable doubt, based on the total absence of evidence that should be there. And there are many specific examples that I could give, evidence that should be there, and it's not there. There's no evidence, for example, for Exodus, that Exodus ever happened, because they should have been able to find these campsites in the Sinai. They never have, so you can say all three scriptures are based on a mythological figure. So that's the sort of thing, when you see all these things pile up, and for 100 years now they've been piling up, all of the arguments against the existence of the Judeo-Christian Islamic God, that's the only one I'm talking about, that you can pretty well make that conclusion, that beyond a reasonable doubt, with always the tenth of a percent possibility that something might change in the future. You got to keep your mind open.
So it's more like atheism as a scientific theory, perhaps backed by these examples, rather than say atheism as an assumption.
I'm sorry, what? I don't understand that.
So your kind of definition of atheism you're proposing is more like as a scientific theory backed by like lack of evidence or what evidence or whatnot, rather than someone like being an atheist based off an assumption, like assuming, or kind of. What I'm saying is, it's not an atheism is like this is how it is and this is not so. I'm just wondering if I think you clarified that atheism you're proposing it works in the way scientific theory does. It's something that's it's evidence based rather than like kind of a statement.
No, I mean that's what I'm saying, that the new atheist position is kind of a unique position, because most of the discussions about God have appeared more in philosophy and in theology writings. There hasn't been a lot from the strict scientific standpoint. And I claim that all four of us new atheist authors took a scientific point of view. A little different in each case. Three of us were scientists. One was a philosopher of science. And then Christopher Hitchens, although he's not a scientist, also based his book on his own observations as a foreign correspondent, war correspondent, and so on. So his also, I consider his arguments, again, evidence-based rather than based on any real theoretical types of discussions that have usually filled the philosophical and theological literature. Any comment?
My comment would be that atheism as a scientific hypothesis is illogical, because the theos part of it is not an observable entity within the world. So it's just the question about God is not a question that could be addressed or settled by any amount of evidence. However, I would turn around then and I would say that does not mean that theological affirmations are arbitrary or willful necessarily. I think experience is very relevant to determining what is reasonable to say about God. And I think the Bible is and the Quran are very interesting to read as records of relevant experience in an ongoing struggle to try to get it right, what people think about God.
Well, none of that couldn't be a purely effect of the material brain. seeking to do what the material brain does. There's no need for any spiritual or soul or any kind of non-material substance to be involved in that kind of thinking. And I would dispute that, again, that God is not detectable, because it's not God himself as some figure that we're detecting, but it's his effects. It's like St. Paul said, God should be detectable by his doing, what's the exact quote? by whatever he does in the actions.
The heavens are his handiwork.
By the actions. So by the actions, you should be able to see some evidence of those actions. And I gave examples: prayer, revelation. There are many truths in the Bible that later get proved to be accurate prophecies and so on. There are many kinds of ways that God's existence can be established. And let me tell you, I make a comment about John Howard again in the book. I said, boy, he talks about these sorts of arguments. He makes these sorts of arguments. Well, God's not really part of science and blah, 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 blah. But then I bet, and I say this in the book, boy, I can just see the headlines when science discovers God. Big headline: theologian John Howard welcomes discovery of God. You think he would turn that down if it really happened? No.
I have a question up there.
Yeah.
You talked at the beginning of your lecture about how the absence of evidence is evidence of absence. Doesn't it take a pretty large assumption to say that the God who creates time and space should be detectable within time and space? And
no, it's not saying that. Again, we're not saying that God's detectable. It's his effects are detectable. Those are
the effects that aren't.
detected
you talk
by.
about how prayer is not answered, but there are people who would tell you all the time that prayer is answered. So, I guess.
But that's not that's just anecdotal evidence. You can't believe anecdotal evidence, because anecdotal evidence is totally unreliable. You have to have controlled experiments. And these experiments that I mentioned they were done by top researchers. And incidentally, these researchers were not skeptics. They were almost to a person believers looking for proof of God's existence. And they thought that here was a way that they could do it. But they were good scientists. There was a lot of previous terrible work in this field by people who claimed to see evidence even though they didn't, who phonied up the data, or who made claims that weren't based on statistically significant results. But in recent years, there's been some good experiments where these guys were honest, competent scientists, and they went where the data went, and they're doing the right thing. And again, talking about respect, I have a lot of respect for these people too. I've communicated with a number of them. In fact, I actually wrote a paper with one of them for a medical journal. That's been going on. And the example I like to give is, suppose that you had some of these experiments going on. People were praying. People of different religions were praying. And they were the thing is done, in a blind way, double blind way, where nobody knows who's being prayed for, and the people who run the experiment don't know who's who. So there's no way that anybody could interfere with the data. And so I said, suppose one of these really good experiments is done, and they found that Catholic prayers helped heal the sick, when Protestant prayers and Jewish prayers and Muslim, Hindu, none of the other prayers worked. Well, I say, if that had happened, you wouldn't have, I could not think of a natural reason. See, the reason you don't believe something is supernatural is because you have natural explanations for it, which are simpler explanations. But if you can't come up with a natural explanation for some phenomenon, some observed phenomenon, then you'd have to accept that there was something there. So all of this is possible. That's the whole point that I'm trying to make, is it could have turned out the other way. It just hasn't so far, and it hasn't so far after hundreds of thousands of years of attempts to find the evidence, that we've reached the stage now where we can conclude, again, beyond a reasonable doubt that there's nothing there. Yes?